it's really great to come and talk to everyone about Dale Spender and this book in particular, because I realized going back and reading it and reading around Dale Spender's work, I realized how much this particular book, Mothers of the Novel, and a couple of others I'll mention, became really fundamental, I suppose, for some work I went on to do. And I've spoken a little bit in previous seminars. I've been really privileged to present to this group on women working in the theatre. And all of this work comes from the very basic fundamental question about what happens when we put women at the center of these kinds of cultural histories. And you'll see how Dale Spender actually conceptualizes that in this book, Mothers of the Novel. So it's a real honor and a privilege to speak to you about this and to remember Dale Spender, who died at the end of last year. And the picture above is the picture of her wearing purple in later years. And the picture below is the Dale Spender that I remember that I met. I was lucky enough to meet a couple of times while I was doing my PhD in the English department at the University of Sydney. I was just telling Joe and Sheila and Marion, we had a group called FELT, which was the acronym for Feminist English Literary Theory, but really it was about the felt need for a women's group looking at women's writing, and Dale Spender came to speak to us a couple of times. In those days, she wore purple, green, and white as the suffragette colours. And she was speaking to us just after, or in the middle of, really, the work that I'm going to talk about today. My first 3 slides, and I'll send these if people want to contact me, or I can, Joe has a copy, so they'll be available through WDI. My first 3 slides are a selected list of Dr. Spender's writing. She wrote a lot, and what's really interesting, and she also set up a press, Pandora Press. What's really interesting, I think, is how much she edited also and how much she wrote collaboratively. Things I would pick up are Man-Made Language, which was a published version of her PhD. And at the end of this slideshow, I've got a link to Deborah Cameron's blog, which is really worth reading, with a reflection on this work by Dale Spender on linguistics and language as the foundation of kind of parts of or an aspect of the oppression and the constraints surrounding women in our history. But she also wrote the wonderful book, There's Always Been a Women's Movement This Century, Pandora Press in 1983. Oops, sorry. Which was written at the time in the 1980s, those of you who might remember, well, the women's work movement is done. It's all about making money. Greed is good. This was the 1980s. This was the start of the kind of idea of choice feminism or liberal feminism. It goes into the 1990s with the sort of ladette movement, and anything a woman chooses to do is feminist because she's a woman. And Dr. Spender was pushing back against that and reminding us that there's still work to do. And also, I think, picking up Virginia Woolf's slogan, which I find really useful in A Room of One's Own, the really foundational text for women's literary history and feminist literary history by Virginia Woolf. She says, we think back through our mothers. And I think that thinking back through our feminist mothers is something that I'm continually doing, and doing this morning, really, with Dale Spender's work. One of her last books was this anthology of Australian women writers. Dale Spender was Australian, although she spent a lot of her time in Britain. And she features quite a lot of Indigenous women writers there, Ruby Langford, Ginny, Eva Johnson, for example, who were just starting to make their voices felt in Australia in the 1990s. They're very powerful voices, in fact. So that's something about Dale Spender's own work. Even more, sorry, it's 4 pages. And the book that I said to Joe I'd be really happy to talk about today, Mothers of the Novel, 100 Good Women Writers Before Jane Austen, first published in 1986 by Pandora Press. And it's a really important work of feminist recovery, finding women writers who've always been there and putting women's fiction writing at the center of the work and as a really significant part of feminist activism. This is the beginning of the book, and it gives you, I think, a flavor. I've tried to incorporate quite a few quotations directly from the work. It gives you a flavor of her style, her approach to speaking to us as readers. I find this book goes down really well with students because they can really grab the voice. They feel like they're being spoken to as equals. This is not the book I started to write. Halfway through my research, I changed my mind when I began my work on early women novelists in the attempt to explore the relationship between women and fiction. I had assumed that women novelists had not really come into their own until the entry of Jane Austen. And that was the start, and that the starting point for my work would be somewhere about the beginning of the 19th century. At that stage, I had no idea that for more than 150 years before Jane Austen, women had been writing novels, and that to return to the early days of women's relationship to fiction meant to go back to the 17th and not the 19th century. Now, there are some really important points there that I'll pick up throughout this hour, but I think one of them is this idea about women's relationship to fiction. And I think this is a really important point. When I'm able to come along to these webinars every Sunday morning, a lot of them are about women's political writing, political manifestos. There have been some really striking works that Marion and Sheila, Lier, various people have explicated for us. And they've been about real world politics, about the real material struggles of feminists and their activist campaigns. I feel like I'm the kind of the soft option talking about theatre and fiction, as I have been lucky enough to do over several of the webinars that I've done for WDI. But I think that rather than the soft option, what we're seeing here is another aspect of feminist activism, and that it's important to name it and articulate it as such, that fiction has been a way for many feminists to both analyze the world as it is, the world as they want it to be, and the gap between those two. And also to think about a woman's point of view. In my own work, I've been very resistant to thinking about, is there a way that women write plays for the theatre and make work for the theatre? There's no one way. But I think there is something about the point of view that women bring because of the material conditions in which women of the past, and indeed in the present, the material conditions in which we live and the constraints and limits on those material conditions. So this is where I think that thinking about women's relationship to fiction can be quite a liberating and significant sort of feminist act. So, as I say, this raises some interesting questions about the focus on fiction and the way that Dale Spender argues we need to start in the 17th century, which is at least 50 years before the first novel is identified. And literary historians before Spender generally saw the work of Daniel Defoe, and particularly the book Robinson Crusoe, as the starting point of the English novel. And this is 1720. And it's a book about a single individual man shipwrecked on what he thinks of as a desert island. Of course, then Man Friday appears. And so the kind of masculinist argument for the start of fiction is in this very imperializing, individualized male story of discovery. And I'll leave you to draw out all the implications of that form or that structure of literary history. I mean, you know, there's some very obvious ones there about the idea of the novel emerging as the idea of this very individual and independent human subject, always male, always masculine, starting to dominate an environment, the supposedly deserted island on which Robinson Crusoe is shipwrecked, and so on. So Dale Spender starts with this outline of literary history, and that's really her first couple of chapters. And she talks about the idea of the man of letters and the woman of letters. And this is at a time when being a writer was not necessarily a profession, and it didn't necessarily make you money. People wrote for all sorts of reasons. And also, we're looking at the 1660s, 1670s, 1680s. You can see there she references John Bunyan's Pilgrim's Progress. But there's a very small fraction of the English-speaking population that can write. And I've had a really interesting discussion with a couple of colleagues working on women's writing in the early part of the 17th century. And the early modern period as a whole. And the whole question that comes up, certainly talking with my students about Shakespeare, and they say, well, most people were illiterate then. How did they understand Shakespeare? Because he's so difficult. And what my early modern colleagues will say is that for a long time, literacy was often separated out between reading and writing. So people who could read might not be able to write. So therefore, you know, the apocryphal story or the old story about Shakespeare's father being this wealthy man of Stratford, but not able to write his own name, was actually not so unusual. He probably could read, but he may well not have been able to write. So think about the access that women had to education, and education being either a kind of thing of aristocratic sociability or something really instrumental, that you needed certain kinds of education to do the job that you were going to do in your life. And you can see why it was not thought very necessary for most women to be educated. They should be able to read enough to be able to read the Bible, maybe enough to write to do household accounts. But, you know, women's work was not about learning. It was about educating, well, you know, conceiving, gestating, birthing, and then raising the next generation. So a lot of the women that Spender introduces us to in the first part of Mothers of the Novel, and it's a three-part piece of scholarship. The first part is this background, and most of the women that she introduces us to are aristocratic. They are educated, although they don't have the same education as their male relatives. But I love this final sentence of the paragraph I've quoted here. I do not take exception to this acknowledgement of paternity, you know, that there are fathers of the novel, but I cannot accept yet another story of creation in which it is the father who gives birth, and where it's held that there were no mothers of the novel. And today, in a world where we're being told that we need to talk about pregnant people, and that certain fathers are trying to tell their children that they're actually their mothers, I thought this was extraordinarily pertinent. So, the other thing I wanted to say about Mothers of the Novel is that Spender is writing in good company. There's, in the 1970s and early 80s, there's a huge recovery project in feminist work, in literary studies. And I'm just citing here, Dale Spender's Mothers of the Novel was really foundational to my work as a postgraduate student, and now as as a kind of a senior, getting on for a senior professor. So with these two books, Elaine Showalter's A Literature of Their Own and Ellen Moore's Literary Women. I really recommend Ellen Moore's Literary Women as a cracking good read. She writes, and again, in a really accessible, you can read Literary Women like a novel, and she's really interested in feminine heroinism, she calls it. Elaine Showalter's book is rather more sort of scholarly in that very professional scholarly way. But they're both, the three books taken together open up women's writing, and particularly the writing of the 19th century, as fertile areas to look for feminist kind of mothers. But I think what's extraordinary about what Dale Spender does is she goes right back to the 17th century, which is often seen as, still a man's world. The other thing about the relationship between women and fiction, and again, I'm a 19th century, I specialize in 19th century literature, and I'm always reminded of George Henry Lewis's advice to women writers of his acquaintance. Now, he is Mr. George Eliot. He was George Eliot's partner, and one of those men who was extraordinarily, one of those very unusual men who was extraordinarily supportive of his female partner, as well he should have been, because George Eliot, is one of the greatest writers in the English language. And I think Middlemarch happens to be one of the best novels ever written. And I will go to my death, I'll fight that one. But George Henry Lewis gave advice to Charlotte Bronte, told her she should read the whole of Jane Austen. And in fact, George Eliot and George Henry Lewis, before George Eliot started to write fiction, they read the works of Jane Austen out loud between them. But he writes about lady novelists, and he says that fiction is the best thing for women to write because of its domestic, interpersonal kind of focus. And I think this is this thing I've quoted here by George Henry Lewis is a bit of a damning with faint praise. It's a bit of a curate's egg. Parts are good, but the good bits are actually constrained and almost infected by the bad bits. The limits, here we see the limits for women's writing and women's thinking, but presented to us in a way that sort of says, well, this is a good thing for women to do, but this far and no further. And I think what's great about what Dale Spender does is she really digs into the way women did not take any notice of this kind of advice. The other bit of advice I want to give you, I don't know if that's filled the whole of the screen, whether you can read all of this, but this is Robert Southey, and, hands up who has ever heard of Robert Southey. But he was poet laureate in the 1830s. This is his advice to Charlotte Bronte. And I think if I asked you how many people know about Charlotte Bronte compared with how many people know about Robert Southey, what's the Twitter term? Southey would be ratioed at this point. Charlotte and her sisters, Anne and Emily, wrote to Southey because he was poet laureate. They didn't really know anyone. They were living, in a small village in Yorkshire. And they asked about having a literary career and publishing their poetry. And he writes back this very famous letter. He says, your poetry is quite good. But, and the middle sentence here, literature cannot be the business of a woman's life, and it ought not to be. The more she is engaged in her proper duties, that is, as a wife and mother, the less leisure she will have for it, even as an accomplishment and a recreation. And then the patronizing here, to those duties you have not yet been called. You know, at some point you'll be lucky enough to get married. And when you are, you will be less eager for celebrity. You will not then seek in imagination for excitement. You know, how wrong was he, really? You just have to laugh at this point. But these two statements from men who are not saying women should never write. You know, Southey said, oh, yeah, your poems show promise. But, you know, this shouldn't be your real work. This shouldn't be where you seek to become yourself. And I think what Dale Spender gives us is a real robust and energetic. I mean, she was robust and energetic in real life, the times I met her, but very human, personable, and humorous, which she also was, account of women who didn't take this advice, who slashed through all the thicket of constraints and obstacles. And here again, she tells us, and this is very early on in her introduction, that the 18th century women should have written at all is in itself a contradiction. For women had no rights, no individual existence or identity. The very act of writing, particularly for a public audience, was in essence an assertion of individual and autonomy, and often an act of defiance. To write was to be, it was to create and to exist. It was to construct and control a worldview without interference from the masters. And I actually think this is something that many women writers and many women artists still carry with them. It's an incredibly powerful understanding of the function of art. And I think really important to remember in the current day and age, working in the humanities in a university as I do, where the humanities are just being slaughtered at the moment. Those of you with children going into the arts and humanities at universities may well see whole departments disappear in front of your eyes at the moment, because we have a government with a policy that does not want people to assert individual and autonomy through art. And I think that this is again becoming a political battle, and we have to hang on to the importance of art and writing in the face of this kind of ideological sort of slaughter. Sorry, I'm getting a bit dramatic there, but at the moment, working in the humanities feels like walking through the sort of smoking ruins of an education system. So Spender's women novelists, in her first section, are 4 women who start with biography. They're all upper middle class or aristocratic. Anne Clifford, who becomes the Countess of Montgomery. Lucy Hutchinson, married to Colonel Hutchinson. Anne Fanshawe, whose husband married into a family, an aristocratic family, supporters of Charles I, and so writes about her exile and traveling all over Europe, in fact, as far as Turkey. And Margaret Cavendish, Duchess of Newcastle, who wrote across all forms. And Spender starts with these 4 women's writing of biography. And what's really interesting is the way that she looks at the way they use biography to set the record straight. So Anne Clifford, for example, was involved in a long legal dispute. She wrote a record of her own life as a record for her children. Margaret Cavendish wrote a lot about everything. And Dale Spender spends most of the rest of the chapter, after introducing us to these 4 women, in looking at the Duchess of Newcastle and looking at the way that she writes about science, she writes biography, she writes poetry. And it made me want to go into the library and seek out her writing. Luckily, you can find, most of this is out of copyright now, so Google Books, the Internet Archive, you can find a lot of the work of these women online. You don't even need access to a bricks and mortar library. You can find a lot of the work online. And then what Margaret Cavendish writes, Dale Spender argues, foreshadows what Mary Wollstonecraft writes 150 years later. Of course, women were intellectual beings, she insisted, and the she there is Margaret Cavendish. And if this was not obvious, there was only one reason for it, their lack of education. And she was certainly not going to blame women for this, although she was puzzled as to why so few of them were prepared to do anything about it. As Mary Wollstonecraft was to do almost 150 years later, and this is referring to Wollstonecraft's 1792 book, A Vindication of the Rights of Women. Margaret Cavendish argued that if women and men were to have the same educational opportunities, they would very soon demonstrate the same intellectual capabilities. And, you know, we regularly have hand-wringing nowadays about how girls are outstripping boys in education. Well, there we go. Then Spender moves into the 18th century, and she starts with the theatre. And I've had the privilege of talking to this audience, this webinar, on 18th century women playwrights, and to start with Aphra Behn. I think what's really interesting is Dale Spender really takes on literary history, and she takes on this moment that previous literary historians have argued that the novel, the English novel, of course, you know, you have European novels like Don Quixote and so on. So we're talking about the English novel, is thought to start with Robinson Crusoe in 1720. And she says, there's just one problem. One of the great dramatists of the Restoration also wrote 13 novels more than 30 years before Robinson Crusoe. Only if this contribution is excluded is there any validity in the theory that it took a fall in the drama to lead to the rise of the novel. And there's a very influential book by Ian Watt, published in the 1950s, called The Rise of the Novel, on which many a school and university curriculum is based. So, of course, as Dale Spender writes, the author of these 13 novels, which have been excised from the history of letters, was a woman, Aphra Behn, and here's Aphra Behn. And I've spoken about Aphra Behn in a previous webinar, so I won't say too much about her now, but, you know, again, she's the writer that Virginia Woolf says all women writers should shower petals on the grave of Aphra Behn. She was, according to Woolf and other literary historians, the first woman who wrote for money in Britain. But Spender has some interesting, before she goes on to the novels, she has some interesting observations to make about Aphra Behn's writing that I think are really interesting general observations. And I've pulled out this paragraph on Behn's play, The Lucky Chance. Throughout all the writings of Aphra Behn, it was men who are being measured by women's standards. When women are the reference point, men do not have it all their own way, which is one of the reasons Aphra Behn did not find favor with all her male colleagues then, and no doubt one of the reasons she's not found favor with literary critics since. And again, Spender comes back to her argument. This is not a good enough reason to exclude half the representations of humanity. And she points out that we have, and she's writing in the 1980s, I think this has changed over the last 40 years really, since Mothers of the Novel, that standards have changed, but we still have to fight about saying, look, literary standards aren't natural. They didn't just drop from heaven. They are constructed, and the way they're constructed is ideological and, you know, in the end, political. It's about power. So again, the kind of thesis statement of Spender's work. This is why it's important to reclaim the writings of the mothers of the novel, not just because it is unjust to exclude them. Sorry, I'm trying to read the chat at the same time. But more importantly, because without them, we are without the symbolic meanings and understandings of half of humanity. And I think that the next sentence is really interesting. Without women writers, literature is reduced to the level of propaganda, the medium for the unchallenged view of the dominant sex. Now, we're often told that women's writing, and feminist writing in particular, is propaganda. It's too much driven by politics. And what Spender does here is she reverses that judgment and says, well, it's propaganda if you only have half of humanity. I think the other important point she makes here is that through women's writing, and particularly through fictional writing, we get the symbolic meanings and understandings of humanity. And so I would use that as to partly to make my case about, you know, that working on women's fiction, women's literature can be quite an important aspect of a kind of feminist activism that complements the other much more political material activism that's, you know, hugely necessary still, sadly. So then, as I said, Mothers of the Novel is a book written in 3 parts. And the second part is a part on literary standards. So Spender goes on to discuss literary history, and these are the chapter titles, just to give you a sense of the way in which she's framing women's writing within literary history. And, you know, continuing this theme of the ways in which a literary history which excludes, on grounds of sort of spurious standards of writing, excludes half of humanity, is a deception. And I'll just go to these chapters. In her chapter on gross deception, she's looking at particularly the work of this book, The Rise of the Novel by Ian Watt. But that book is symbolic or representative of a whole school of literary history and literary criticism, which connects the rise of the novel to the rise of mercantilist capitalism, to the rise of the individual. So thus we get the focus on Defoe's Robinson Crusoe and the other Defoe novel, Moll Flanders, which is the story of a prostituted woman. You can see there the kind of political or ideological narrative, the idea of the individual mercantilist capitalist man, the idea that capitalism is, you know, until we get to Marx, it's about individual ambition and work ethic, I suppose, and the idea that Moll Flanders is seen as a kind of, you know, exemplar of a capitalist woman selling her body, gives you a sense of how problematic that theory about the rise of the novel might be if we then say, well, hang on a second, who else was writing at this time and what kinds of culture do they represent? I mean, it's interesting that in Defoe's Moll Flanders, you know, she has all these children and they're sort of just shunted off to the countryside. Whereas the women that Spender is writing about are often dealing centrally with ideas about partnership, marriage, children. And they're about, you know, that most important economic decision that women made, which was whom they would marry. So they're working within these sorts of constraints and giving us, you know, a sense of the world from within that closed, apparently closed kind of set of sex-based stereotypes. And I'm just leafing through the book as I'm talking to you, and Spender in table 4 gives a list of 106 women novelists and 568 novels before Jane Austen. And her next project after writing this book was to set up with Pandora Press a publishing project to publish at least one of the novels by all of these women. It didn't quite get to that point, but you'll often see, unfortunately, Pandora Press got sold off and is no more, but you'll often see in secondhand bookshops these volumes that are like the, I'll just flick right back to the beginning of the slideshow, and you can see the picture there, the cover of Mothers of the Novel and the Pandora Press and that design. Look out for that in secondhand bookshops and literary fiction, because you'll be able to pick up a lot of these novels. And here's a list of some of the women that were reprinted in the series. But books that are not in this series, Penelope Aubain, 1679 to 1731, wrote how many? 7 books in the 1720s, starting with The Strange Adventures of the Count Le Vineville and his family, Count de Veneville, I suppose, and his family. In 1722, writes a novel, The Noble Slaves, or the Lives and Adventures of Two Lords and Two Ladies upon a Desolate Island. I mean, what a wonderful title. It makes me want to go and read that book. So, you know, there's a huge job of work that Spender took on. And here are some of the women in part 3 that she discusses. Now, some of them may be familiar to you. Sarah Fielding was the sister of Henry Fielding, wrote novels, wrote a lot of novels, and they're really good fun. Virago Press has reprinted some of them, and Pandora Press. Charlotte Lennox. Spender asks the question, was this really the first female American novelist? Elizabeth Inchbald, I've spoken about on one of these webinars. I've spoken about Elizabeth Inchbald. She was an actress, became really one of the first female theatre critics, and indeed one of the first literary critics. She moved from being an actress to being a playwright, and then moved into writing novels and literary criticism. And she produced this huge body of literary criticism by writing prefaces to probably about 200 plays in an edition of a kind of collected edition of the English drama. But she also wrote a series of novels that are seen as an important part of the kind of the movement to write the novel of sentiment, which predates the idea of romanticism and the romantic poets by about 20 or 30 years. So she's writing about feeling. Charlotte Smith, who wrote novels and conduct books. Anne Radcliffe. If you're into the Gothic, this is the mother lode, right? Anne Radcliffe wrote these wonderful novels, which are all about, you know, women caught in castles in the Pyrenees and so on. And they're really extraordinary exploration of female sensibility under pressure. Mary Wollstonecraft, the mother of us all in feminist terms, but she also wrote novels, and again, used the Gothic form. I think really the kind of notion of the Gothic was an extraordinary form for women to use, because it starts to really, through the literary form itself, not just the characters or the plot, but the actual premise of the Gothic, that the imposition of the occult into ordinary everyday life, the fears of being locked up, of being imprisoned, of being controlled by forces beyond one's own control. you might see these as a kind of psychological or psychic working through of what it was like to be a woman in the 18th and early 19th century. And I think, you know, the kind of the appropriation of the Gothic by people like Bram Stoker in Dracula do some very interesting things with the form, but in many ways, it's a form that emerges as a way for women to start to describe what it's like to be a woman. And in some ways to kind of project it outward, you know, rather than, as it were, speaking the truth, which would have them categorized as mad, really. Mary Hayes here on this list writes the novel of sensibility, but also the sort of novel of common sense, like Mary Brunton. And Fanny Burney is fascinating. She's kind of pimped out by her father as part of the royal court. She really writes about aristocratic life close up. Maria Edgeworth and Lady Morgan give us an Irish point of view. And insofar as English literature has always appropriated, you know, there's still a kind of imperializing, colonizing attitude towards literature in England literature in English, sorry, coming from Ireland. But Maria Edgeworth and Lady Morgan offer some extraordinary accounts, you know, Castle Rackrent, about a kind of Irish family in the late 18th century is this hilarious but often quite dark novel by Maria Edgeworth. She also wrote for children, and a lot of these writers wrote for children. Not and often it's seen as, well, you know, women are good for writing for children, but I think that they took that work very seriously as the work of educating the next generation. And again, it's been a very fruitful area for feminist literary history to look at children's literature, and particularly children's literature written by women. It's often seen as a less serious, a less important area of scholarship. You know, 20 years ago, you would have to justify why you were doing that if you wanted an academic job. And again, it's that denigration of the work created in and through those sex-based categories, if you like, of women's lives and women's work. And one of the things I always find really uplifting about working on these kinds of literatures and these women is the ways in which that they were constantly butting up against the constraints of femininity of their time and protesting it, but often not in a kind of a, you know, a kind of stereotypical burn your bra way. They're often doing it in very clever, very unobtrusive ways. And I sometimes think that that sort of subversive and transgressive smiling while digging the knife in were very effective. Not to say that the more overt and explicit protests were not important. And I think we need both. I think this is something that I kind of look at with current kind of feminist debates and say, we need the working under the radar, and we need the people that push the boundaries. It's often at the boundaries where new things are defined. But Spencer's argument here is that these women, even if they were working within the constraints of what it was to be, you know, particularly a middle-class, respectable lady at this time, even if they were working within those constraints, what they were doing was, we can now see as revolutionary. So towards the end of the book, she starts to reflect on the work and why it's important. And she writes about how she selected the writers for her book. And she says, initially, I thought it would not be possible to formulate a sensible basis for selection. But that was before it occurred to me to look to the women critics for guidance. And of course, one reason I was so slow to turn to the women of letters was because I didn't know they were there. And I think one of the wonderful things that Spender does in Mothers of the Novel is she dramatizes the ways in which women are kept deliberately ignorant of their own history. And she does it without blaming herself or blaming the women that went before. You know, she's quite upfront about the aristocratic women, the conservative women, the women who didn't really like other women. She doesn't blame them. She says, well, how can you blame them? This is the world in which they lived. And here I think it's wonderful. She doesn't blame herself. She says, well, of course I didn't know this. And by saying that, she articulates the ways in which literary history, education, and language itself are structured in order to maintain this kind of ignorance. It's strategic ignorance for patriarchy, if you like. And then she says, there've always been women critics. There've been women critics almost as long as there've been women novelists. And they've linked themselves with the women writers, not simply by their efforts to assess the quality of women's work. Oh, sorry, I often dictate stuff and the dictation there has not converted, dash, but by coming to share much the same fate as the women they wrote about, oblivion. So she finishes the book by talking about the ways in which women critics have also been ignored. And the existence of these women critics also helps to show that even while men have been mainstream and have been putting forward the achievements of men, there have been alternative, equivalent, but obscured activity amongst women critics who have continued to put forward the literary achievements of women. And so, you know, the work of people who come after them is to make that work visible. And I wanted to finish by talking just a little bit, and then I'll look at the chat and try and sort of answer any points or questions. I wanted to finish with a book that I think could not have been written without Dale Spender's book. And one of the sad things, and, you know, I say this with regret, because I also know and esteem the scholar I'm going to discuss for 2 seconds now, is that this next book I want to talk about, Anne Mellor's book, Mothers of the Nation, doesn't reference Dale Spender's book, Mothers of the Novel. And I just think this is, I see in front of me with great regret in looking at these two books, both of which I've read and both of which I use, both scholars I esteem and have corresponded with or spoken to, learnt from, that what we see is this repetition of invisibility of previous women's work. But I wanted to say a little bit about Anne Mellor's book, Mothers of the Nation. It's a much more academic book. I'm not sure you find it in a local library, but if you've got access to interlibrary loans or a good university library, a good research library, it's worth having a look at. She writes in the wake of a whole lot of work about the idea of the public sphere, based on a book by a German scholar called Jürgen Habermas, and he argues that it's in the 18th century where we get this public sphere that we all live in now. He talks about the coffee house, and it's this sort of move from politics and government being the preserve of the aristocracy, those born into power, and it becoming that power and politics becoming democratized and becoming exercised through discourse, through discussion, through debate, through newspapers, through discussions in coffee houses. You know, nowadays we might talk about Twitter being the public sphere of political debate, although I wish it weren't. I think we have to, you know, knock that one on the head. And Habermas talks exclusively about male and masculine culture. And Anne Mellor picks him up on this and says he's, just as Dale Spender did in 1986, and says, you have ignored half of the population. And she goes on to talk about Hannah More, who Spender also discusses, Joanna Bailey, Hannah Cowley, Elizabeth Inchbald. She talks about the theatre as a place of doing politics. She talks about women's political poetry, Hannah More, Anna Barbauld, Lucy Aitken. She talks about literary criticism and cultural authority in the rise of the novel. And then she finishes with the politics of fiction, and she talks about Charlotte Smith and Jane Austen. And when I was preparing this webinar, I just thought I can't say how sad it makes me that these two scholars are not talking to each other. And haven't talked to each other. I think it's partly also about the difference between British scholarship and, I'm sorry to say, American literary scholarship exists in a little bit of a bubble. But, both of these books, I think what I would finish, well, I don't know, am I up to finishing? Yes. Yeah, so this is my kind of, thing for us to think about, is that they both teach us about the ways in which the art can be very political, but not in the ways we might think. And I think that sometimes the most effective political art is the subtle art. It's not the in-your-face, women are oppressed. And I had the great privilege of listening to the Feminist Question Time session yesterday with Sarah Vacci. And I've seen her paintings at Filia, for example, and the way in which, just by giving us portraits of detransitioned women and showing their humanity, their beauty, just their humanity, these are really powerful paintings. And they're not plastered all over with, this is how harmful, stereotypes of what it is to be a girl. And if you're not these stereotypes, then you're a boy, this sort of harmful ideology. They're these simple but very complex, because they're human portraits of these women. And I think this is what the novel does. And if we really value Jane Austen for the way that she writes about women's lives, women's cultures, women's very thoughts and being, then Dale Spender gives us the tools for thinking of, 100, which she counts 106 women writers before Jane Austen, who Jane Austen read. I mean, Jane Austen would have read novels by all of the women on this current slide. I'm pretty sure she went to the theatre. She probably read Mary Wollstonecraft, although she couldn't say that she did, because Wollstonecraft was, persona non grata. She was a fallen, wicked woman by living with William Godwin without marriage. But, how important it is to sort of have a sense of where we come from. And anytime anyone dismisses a film as a chick flick or a rom-com, or, oh, that's just romantic fiction, that's just a romance novel, oh, that's women's stuff, this is what you tell them back, that there is this long history of women's writing that takes on really serious issues, but takes them on from the human point of view. I kind of think this is more human than, 1984 politics, for example. Takes them on from within what it is, this human subjectivity of what it is to live as a woman within these constraints. So that's my preaching over for Sunday morning. I'm just going to have a look at the chat. Shall I stop sharing my slides, or do we want to leave this slide up as a...
I would stop sharing them so we can see you. That's really nice.
All right. Oh, well, no, you don't want to see me. But I'll just pull up the chat now and see if there's any questions that have come up that I might be able to comment on or ask. Yeah. Oh, yes, people, lovely chat about Afro Ben. she is so wonderful. I mean, you know, there really needs to be a film about Afroben's life, about being possibly a spy. And oh yeah,
There's also,
someone, sorry,
yeah,
go on.
there's something in the Q&A from
Ah, right.
Alice
Oh,
that
I'll have a
says
look at
thank
that.
you for your talk.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
Oh yes. I've heard her, that book, that Dale Spender book. I would have to look at my notes. Yes, Alice Lynn is saying, thank you. That's a great question. Where you've heard her speak. I've also heard Dale Spender speak about timing the amount that men speak versus the amount women speak. It's probably in man-made language, and it's probably also in the book Reflecting Men Twice Their Size. And I heard her talk about, she and a friend who was a school teacher, she came and gave us a talk at my university a couple of times. So this is anecdote, but I'm pretty sure it's in her book on language, or women of ideas and what men have done to them, where a friend of hers was a school teacher teaching in a mixed comprehensive. And they conducted this experiment where her friend gave half, really made sure that she gave attention to the girls in her class 50% of her time. She timed it. And what ended up was that the boys ended up giving 50% of her time to the girls and 50% to the boys. The boys ended up feeling they were ignored, and the girls felt that she was on their case the whole time. And what they concluded from that was that boys were socialized. It was natural, you know, it was socialized and natural for them to feel that they should get 90% of the teacher's attention. Girls were used to getting a much smaller proportion of the teacher's attention and felt really hassled when they received half the teacher's time. And I think, you know, and this is a theme of Dale Spender's work in many of her works, where she argues that, you know, it's good old socialization and conditioning, that we don't notice how conditioned we are as women to fit into the gaps that men leave us, and men don't notice how much they dominate. So I'm pretty sure there's she probably writes that up, possibly in man-made language or in Reflecting Men at Twice Their Size, which again is a quotation from Virginia Woolf. Virginia Woolf is such a lodestone for so many women writing in this field. Yeah, so it's really interesting. And I'm aware, I teach a module at my university on women in theatre. And I'm very aware if I've got a young man in the class, I kind of pay special attention to him, partly because I don't want him to feel alienated, because I want him to learn. And I think it's great that he's there. But I'm also laughing at myself for being such a good, you know, a good patriarchal woman. I don't ever want to put those young men on the spot, because I think it's great they're doing feminist modules. But I'm also aware of the tendency to sort of, you know, try and make sure they feel comfortable, in a way that I'm not sure that any male professor ever made me feel comfortable when I might have been the only woman in the room. But anyway, you know, try and be nice. Anyway, I don't know. Yes, it's 11 o'clock now, so I should finish there. And I'll copy, Alice, I'll copy your email and try and get back to you.
Thank you very much, Kate.
Well,
that was really fantastic, and look forward to your next talk.
well, it's a privilege to have the soapbox. Thank you.
Okay, bye everybody.
Bye-bye.